A single sheet of wool left out overnight on English grass can pull nearly a pint of clean drinking water from the air by morning. This is not folklore, and it is not a trick reserved for survivalists in some far-off desert. It is a method shepherds in the Yorkshire Dales relied on for generations, long before anyone thought to pay a water company a penny for something that had always fallen freely from the sky. I grew up on a small holding above a village most maps do not bother naming, tucked into a fold of the Dales where the mist sits low in the valley bottom until nearly 10 in the morning most days of the year. My grandfather kept sheep there, and he kept them the old way, without piped water reaching every field the way it does now. He taught me how to read the land for moisture, the way another man might read a clock. And by the time I was 10 years old, I could tell you which nights would leave the grass soaked through and which would leave it bone dry, just from the feel of the air on my face at dusk. These were not stories told to amuse a child on a winter's evening by the fire. They were daily practiced, the difference between a flock that drank well through a dry spell and one that did not. And I watched these methods work with my own eyes through more winters and more summers than I care to count now. I am sharing them with you because fewer and fewer people still know them. And that seems to me a poor way to lose something so genuinely useful. Something changed in this country, somewhere around the middle of the last century. Water that had always been gathered, stored, and managed by ordinary households quietly became something you were billed for every quarter, piped in through infrastructure you never see and have no say over. The companies that built that system had no interest in reminding anyone that rain, mist, and dew had been doing the job for free since long before the Romans ever set foot on this island. And so those older methods were simply left to fade from memory. Not because they stopped working, but because nobody stood to profit from you remembering them. It suited certain industries very well for people to believe that clean water only ever comes from a tap or a bottle bought at a shop, and so the old knowledge was quietly set aside rather than lost outright. And that is a distinction worth holding on to as we go through this together. What you are about to hear is not a theory dreamed up for a video. These are methods tested across hundreds of dry summers and damp autumns by people who had no other choice but to make them work. They worked then in cottages with no main supply at all, and they still work now in gardens and allotments up and down the country for anyone patient enough to try them properly. The first method is the wool fleece, and it is the oldest one I know. Older by far than anything you will find written down in a modern household guide. Take a piece of raw, unwashed sheep's wool if you can get hold of one, or failing that, a thick length of clean cotton toweling, and lay it flat across short grass in an open spot away from trees and hedgerows just before the sun goes down. Weight the corners lightly with stones so it does not shift in the night air, and make sure it lies flat against the grass rather than bunched up in the middle where the air cannot reach it properly. By first light, before the sun has had a proper chance to warm the ground. That fleece will be heavy and damp, sometimes soaked through completely, because wool draws moisture out of humid night air far more efficiently than most people expect it to. The fibers are naturally suited to it, holding water against their surface the way they always have. Whether that water comes from rain or simply from the air cooling around them as the temperature drops after sunset. Wring it out into a clean bowl, and a good fleece the size of a bath towel can yield close to a pint on a proper misty night in autumn or spring, sometimes more if the conditions favor you. My grandfather kept 3 such fleeces in rotation for the lambing pens each spring, moving them between the low pasture and the yard depending on where the mist had settled thickest the evening before, and I never once saw them fail him during a wet spell. He would check them before the birds were properly awake, wring them straight into the trough, and have them back out drying on the fence by the time breakfast was on the table. He always said unwashed wool worked better than a cleaned fleece, because the natural grease in the fiber, what farmers call the lanolin, holds droplets on the surface rather than letting them soak straight through and drip away into the grass beneath. If you do not keep sheep yourself, a neighbor who does will very likely part with an offcut of raw fleece for next to nothing. Since it is usually treated as a waste product at shearing time, a fleece can be reused for years if it is dried properly between uses and kept somewhere free of damp. So there is no need to think of this as a method that costs you anything beyond one small favor asked of a neighbor. The second method, and this one surprises most people who hear it for the first time, is the dew pond, across the chalk downs of Wiltshire and in parts of the Yorkshire wolds, not far from where I was raised. Shepherds once built shallow, saucer-shaped ponds lined with puddled clay, straw, and sometimes a thin layer of soot pressed down hard beneath the clay to seal it further. These ponds were set deliberately in open pasture, well away from any tree that might shade them or drop leaves into the water. Because open exposure to the night sky was the entire point of the design, not an oversight. These ponds were not fed by streams or springs at all, despite what most visitors assume. When they see one sitting full of water on a hilltop with no obvious source nearby for miles around, they filled almost entirely from dew and condensation, because the clay lining held the cold of the night far longer than the surrounding soil. And warm, moist air passing over that cold surface gave up its water the same way your breath fogs a cold window on a winter morning. Some of these ponds, built well over a century ago by farm laborers with nothing more than shovels and cartloads of clay, still hold water to this day, refilled season after season by nothing more than the temperature difference between clay and air. It is worth remembering that this was engineering, plain and practical, worked out by ordinary countrymen who understood their landscape better than most of us understand our own gardens today, without a single textbook between them. Records from the 1800s describe teams of men, sometimes called dupin makers, who traveled from farm to farm across the southern counties, building these ponds for a fee. A trade passed from father to son, much like any other craft of the period. The best of them knew to choose a slight hollow on a hilltop rather than a valley bottom, since cold air and moist air both settle differently across open high ground than they do lower down. And getting that judgment wrong could mean a pond that never filled properly at all. Some farms kept several such ponds scattered across their higher fields, each one enough to water a full flock through a dry summer without a single bucket ever being carried up from the valley below. A modern household cannot dig a dew pond in the back garden overnight, but the same principle scales down beautifully. And that is where the third method comes in, one that a great many people can put into practice this very week. Take a shallow basin, even an old tin bath, or a wide ceramic dish you no longer use in the kitchen, and bury it so its rim sits level with the surrounding soil in an open part of the garden, well clear of overhanging branches. Line the bottom with a few inches of clean clay if you can source it locally, or, failing that, a layer of smooth stones which hold cold nearly as well as clay does through the coldest part of the night. Set it out before nightfall and leave it uncovered until morning, resisting the temptation to check on it too soon. Since the best collection tends to happen in the hours just before dawn, when the air is coldest, the metal or ceramic surface cools faster than the air around it after sunset, and moisture condenses directly onto it, exactly as it did in the old chalk ponds, only on a scale you can manage entirely with your own two hands and whatever containers you already own around the house. Keep watching, because the fourth method is where most people are genuinely surprised, and it involves nothing more exotic than a sheet of plain window glass. Victorian households, particularly in the damper parts of Cumbria and the Lake District, kept cold frames and conservatory windows for more purposes than simply raising seedlings in early spring. On a cool, clear night, a single pane of glass propped at a slight angle over a collecting trough will gather condensation in genuinely remarkable quantities, because glass loses heat to the night sky faster than almost any other common household material. Set your pane so one edge sits an inch or two lower than the other, propped on a couple of bricks or a low wooden frame, with a shallow gutter or simply a folded strip of tin beneath the low edge to catch the runoff as it trickles down. By morning, water droplets that formed across the entire surface of the glass will have run down and pooled in that gutter, sometimes filling a jam jar from a single ordinary window pane on a clear autumn night when conditions favor it well. This was, in effect, free household water gathered while the family slept soundly indoors. And it required nothing more than glass that most cottages already had lying about in a shed or an old cold frame somewhere near the vegetable beds. You will find this method works best on nights when the sky is completely clear rather than overcast, because cloud cover holds heat close to the ground and slows the glass from cooling as quickly as it needs to. A north-facing pane, kept out of any residual warmth from a house wall, will generally outperform one fixed to a south-facing surface, simply because it loses its heat to the night sky, with nothing standing in the way. Several panes arranged together, each with its own small gutter, will of course multiply your yield considerably. And this was exactly how larger households once managed to supplement a proper rain, but during a dry stretch of weather. The fifth method takes us underground, quite literally, to the root cellars and stone larders that every self-sufficient household once kept as a matter of course, not as a novelty. A cellar dug 3 or 4 feet into the earth stays remarkably cool and stable in temperature compared to the air above it, often 10 to 15 degrees cooler than a summer afternoon at the surface. If you place a covered container of cold well water, or even simply a sealed metal drum, down in such a space, moisture from the warmer air drawn in through the cellar door will condense on its cold surface, just as it does on a glass of iced water left standing in a warm kitchen. Farmers use this exact trick with milk churns kept in stone dairies, wiping the collected condensation off the outside each morning with a clean cloth and adding it to the household supply, a small amount perhaps, but a steady and reliable one, day after day, that added up considerably across a full season. Nothing here required electricity, plastic tubing, or anything you could not have built with tools and materials available 200 years ago. And that, to my mind, is exactly the point of sharing it with you now. Most modern houses no longer have a proper cellar, but a north-facing garage, a stone outbuilding, or even the coolest corner of a shed can serve much the same purpose if it stays shaded through the warmest part of the day. The principle does not care what the room was originally built for, only that it holds a steady, cooler temperature than the air passing through it, and a great many outbuildings on older properties still meet that description perfectly well. The sixth method concerns grass and low vegetation directly, without any collecting vessel at all, and it is perhaps the simplest of the lot, requiring nothing but a cloth and a spare 20 minutes before breakfast. On a heavily dewed morning, before the sun has burned the moisture away, take a clean cloth and drag it slowly across long grass, meadow herbs, or even the leaves of a cabbage patch or a row of runner beans. Wring the cloth out into a container as it becomes saturated, and repeat the process across a reasonable stretch of garden or paddock while the dew is still heavy on the ground. This will never replace a tap on its own, but in wartime England, when rationing touched nearly everything, including water in some districts, this exact method supplemented household supplies in rural communities where every single drop genuinely mattered to a family's week. It costs nothing but a short walk before breakfast, and the grass loses nothing by giving up. Water it would only have lost to evaporation within the hour, regardless of whether you collected it or not. But that is only the first half of what I have for you today, because the next 4 methods take these same simple principles further into places most people never think to look for water at all. The 7th method uses plastic sheeting, which sounds thoroughly modern, but the principle behind it is ancient and was once achieved with animal skins and oiled canvas long before plastic ever existed as a material at all. Dig a shallow pit roughly 2 feet across in a sunny, open part of the garden, ideally somewhere with slightly damp soil sitting just beneath the dry surface. Place a small, clean container at the very center of the pit. Then stretch a sheet of clear plastic or oiled canvas loosely across the top, weighting the edges firmly with soil so no warm air can escape from underneath. Place a single small stone in the center of the sheet so it sags gently downward directly above your container, forming a low point for water to gather and drip toward through the night. Moisture from the soil itself, drawn upward by the heat of the day and trapped beneath the sheet, condenses on the underside of the covering and drips steadily down to that low point, falling reliably into the container below through the night and into the following morning. This is slower than the fleece or the glass pane, often taking a full day and night to yield a meaningful amount of water. But it works with nothing more than soil moisture and sunlight, and it continues working even in dry spells when dew itself becomes scarce elsewhere in the garden. Adding a few handfuls of fresh-cut grass or green leaves into the bottom of the pit before covering it will noticeably increase your yield, since the moisture held inside the plant material is drawn out by the same heat and adds to what the soil alone provides. A pit of this size, checked once a day and reset with fresh greenery each time, can quietly supply a cupful or more even through the driest week of an English summer, which is precisely when every other method on this list will be working hardest to keep pace. The 8th method is one my grandfather always called reading the spiders, and it sounds a strange thing to say until you understand the reasoning sitting behind it properly. Spiders build their webs more often than not in the exact spots where night air moves and settles predictably, because that same moving air carries the small insects they depend on for food. A garden corner thick with dew-laden webs on a given morning is telling you, quite precisely, where moisture collects most reliably on your own particular plot of land, information that would otherwise take you a full season of trial and error to work out for yourself. Watch your garden closely over a week or two, note where the webs gather the heaviest dew each morning without fail, and place your fleeces, basins, and glass panes in those exact spots going forward rather than guessing at it blindly. It is a small piece of quiet observation that saves considerable wasted effort down the line, and it costs you nothing at all but a little patience and a habit of looking properly at what is already right in front of you. Long grass left slightly uncut in one corner of a garden will draw more of these webs than a lawn kept short and tidy. So there is a genuine argument for leaving one modest patch a little wild, if collecting water matters to you. This is one of those small pieces of country sense that never appears in a gardening book, because it belongs to observation passed from one generation to the next, rather than anything written down and sold. The ninth method is not a single technique, but a way of thinking about all the others together, and it may be the most important lesson in the whole video for you to take away. No single method described so far will replace a modern water supply entirely, and Arthur Whitfield has never once claimed otherwise to anyone who has written in to ask him, but a household running 2 or 3 of these methods together, a fleece laid on the lawn, a basin buried by the vegetable patch, a glass pane propped over the cold frame, can reasonably gather several pints to a gallon or more across a single humid night, particularly through spring and autumn, when the swing in temperature between day and night is at its widest and most favorable. Store what you collect in a clean, covered container straight away. Use it first for washing, watering seedlings, or topping up a livestock trough, and you will very likely find your dependence on the mains tap dropping noticeably within a matter of weeks, without any great sacrifice on your part. This is the surprising step most people miss entirely, because they try one method once, in the wrong conditions, and give up before ever combining approaches the way a proper countryman always would have done as a matter of routine. Keep a simple log if it helps you, noting which mornings gave the heaviest yield and which methods worked best in which spot. And within a single season, you will know your own garden's habits better than any general guide could ever tell you. The 10th and final method concerns keeping what you have gathered fit to use, because collected water left standing in the open invites algae and insects within a matter of days, and all your earlier effort would be wasted for the want of a simple habit. A dark, sealed container kept somewhere cool, away from direct sunlight, will keep collected water usable for washing and gardening purposes, for a good stretch of time, often several weeks without any trouble at all. A folded layer of clean cotton cloth stretched over the opening as a simple filter will keep out debris, midges, and falling leaves, while still letting you pour freely whenever you happen to need it. It is a small habit, checking and covering your containers each morning before the day gets away from you. But it is the difference between a useful, lasting system and one that spoils itself within a week through simple neglect on your part. I think often about how much of this knowledge simply sat unused in my own family for a generation. Not because it ever stopped working, but because nobody needed it once the mains pipe finally reached our village sometime in the 1960s. It is a strange thing to watch skills your own grandfather relied on every single day of his working life become, within the space of one lifetime, something people assume never really existed at all, outside of an old story told for entertainment. What strikes me most, looking back on it now, is how little any of it ever required. No machinery, no subscription, no permission from anyone sitting in an office somewhere far from the land. Just an understanding of how cold surfaces, warm air, and a bit of patience work together the way they always have done. Freely available to anyone willing to step outside before the sun burns the dew away each morning. That is not nostalgia talking. It is simply what I watched work, season after season, for most of my life on that hillside, and what I have since watched work in my own garden many times over since those years. I do not say any of this to suggest a person should cut themselves off from the mains supply entirely, because that would be a foolish thing to promise anyone watching this. What I do say is that a household which knows these 10 methods is never entirely dependent on a single pipe, a single bill, or a single company's goodwill, and there is a real and lasting comfort in that, whatever else changes around you. My grandfather never once described himself as clever for knowing these things, only careful. And I have come to think that carefulness of that kind is worth a great deal more than people tend to credit it these days. If this has been useful to you, there are a good many more methods where this one came from. I share a new one every day, drawn from the same well of old country practice that my grandfather passed down to me on that small holding above the village where I was raised. The old ways are still here, quietly waiting for anyone who wants them. You simply have to know where to look.